I'm going to give it one more minute, Tabs, and then we'll start.
Sounds good.
All right, everybody, welcome to the sixth in a series of webinars hosted by Ortho Mentor. I'm Bill Levine from New York. We have an incredible cast of faculty tonight, all committed to education and mentorship for students and residents. And so it's really exciting for us to be here. Sandy Klein, once again from WashU in St. Louis. Kim Templeton joining us for the first time from the University of Kansas. Welcome, Dr. Templeton. Tessa Bala visiting us from University of Chicago, and George Dyer from Harvard. And Tab Zayer, of course, one of the three original co-developers of Ortho Mentor. Tonight, we're going to cover a lot of topics in preparation for getting your application ready to submit through ERIS. We've got a jam-packed agenda, 2 items for housekeeping. Number 1, we will not be covering the interviews at all. And so a little teaser alert is November 16th, 2020. We will have our 7th webinar focusing only on interviews. So we're gonna wait till then for that. And as always, please send your questions through the chat room, and I will be monitoring the chat room for questions. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tab Zayer, who's going to take us through tonight's webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Dr. Levine, thank you for your kind introduction, as always. I'm honestly humbled and privileged to be in this amongst this elite group of individuals. And so without any hesitation, I really want to get started with many of the questions that are burning in the students' minds about how to handle various facets of the application process. And that's really what this is going to be focusing on tonight. So I'm going to start with Dr. Dyer and Dr. Balich about letters of recommendation, because I know that's something that's kind of really coming into students' minds on the regular. And I'll put this question to Dr. Dyer to start, which is it a problem if I, as a student, do not have all orthopedic letters in your mind?
First of all, I just want to take 2 seconds to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'm just really honored and really delighted to be part of this. So thanks very much. It's a great question. This is the year that if you have a letter that's a non-ortho letter from somebody who knows you well, I would encourage you to use it. And the reason is that this is the year when it's going to be hardest for us really to get a good sense beyond your most cut and dried sort of CV-based things. It's going to be the hardest for us to get a sense of who you are, because most of us have not gotten a chance to meet most of you. And so I would say, and this is going to be an answer really mainly for me and my program, but I think others may feel the same way, that this is the year that a letter from somebody not an orthopedist who knows you well is more valuable than it would ever have been otherwise.
So that's a wonderful perspective. So Dr. Balich, do you think similarly at University of Chicago? Are you going to share the same perspective, or is it going to be kind of contingent on whether you have a home program or don't have a home program specifically?
I think it doesn't matter very much. Like Dr. Dyer just said, we want to hear from the people who know you the best. And this year, because rotations are weird, electives are happening on odd timing, you might not have had the opportunity to spend time with an orthopedic surgeon, whether at your home program or if you don't have a home program. But we want to know who you are as a person, and that might not come from an orthopedic surgeon. It's great if you can have at least 1 or 2 that are from an orthopedic surgeon to speak to some of the things that are unique to our profession. But having some voices and some contributions to your application outside of that certainly won't be looked down upon.
Now, in the same way, like when I was going through the whole process, I didn't have a very close relationship because I didn't come out of the womb knowing I wanted to do orthopedics. So with that in mind, I did not have a great relationship with my faculty and residents at the time. So if I have a home program, is a non-ortho letter okay in that particular setting?
So I will speak from personal experience. I did not have a great personal relationship with a lot of the faculty in my home program. I had a gynecologic oncologist write one of my letters, and it was, as I was told after the fact, because I didn't see the letter ahead of time, just so superbly well written. And from the perspective of a proceduralist who had a sense of what it meant to be a surgeon and what it would take to be successful in that, even though he wasn't an orthopedic surgeon.
If I could just amplify that one part, the key
Please.
is how well the writer knows you. You don't know how well they write. I mean, there's no way to tell that, but you do know, I think, how well they know you. And so it's not what fancy title they have. It's not anything about them. It's really about how well they know you. And so I would encourage you just to ask somebody who you think is going to be a good letter writer because they know you well. Could you do this? And if they say yes, then I think this is the year to do it.
And I think it's also fair to ask if they're comfortable writing a letter for your orthopedic surgery application. Be really clear about what you need.
I think that's a great point, and you guys have touched upon another important question is that I'm getting asked all the time. Do you need the narrative letter? Do you need the standard letter of recommendation, or do you need both? And so I'll turn that to you to start, Dr. Dyer, and then Dr. Balich, I want to hear your perspective as well.
So I think I both want to encourage the use of the standard letter because it's the only way we have to ask letter writers to compare applicants to each other. That's the reason, really, I think the nugget of value that we get from that. But at the same time, again, because we haven't had the pleasure of meeting most of you, we really are looking for something else that's going to give us details about you. And so either to put a long narrative into the standard letter, which is available, or to do both would be my request for every applicant this year.
So I think you can accomplish both with the standard letter because as Dr. Dyer just mentioned, there is a section in the standardized letter for a narrative component for it. And I think one of the nice things about the standardized letter is it kind of pushes people away from regurgitating everything that's already on your CV. I already know from reading your application that you've had 5 publications and that you did this volunteer activity and ran the orthopedic surgery interest group. But I want to know about you. And I think the standardized letter, because it gets some of the standard stuff out of the way quickly, allows for that narrative portion to be a much more rich opportunity to talk about you as a person.
Yeah, and I would venture to say, at least even from the Miami perspective, that the narrative section may get scrutinized to some extent a little bit more this year, just to try to tease out some of those more personal details that you and Dr. Dyer are alluding to. Now, as a person who didn't match the first time, and I want to put this all to the students, yes, I did not match the first time. If I am a re-applicant doing a surgery year or a prelim year, can I use letters from last year? And do they technically need to be updated? So I'll direct that to you, Dr. Balich, first.
I would say get updated letters. A lot's happened in a year, and our hope that if you're reapplying, you've taken the time to think about what's happened in the last year, reflect on the changes you've made in your clinical experience, in your research experience, your sort of own personal development and growth. And it would be wonderful to read that in your letters. So I would highly encourage you to get those letters either updated from prior letter writers or have fresh letters from people who are currently working with you.
Dr. Dyer, any other thoughts?
Can I just ask, there's a couple of questions coming in about this, about the ESLOR and regular letters. And George and Tessa, are you encouraging your students to just ask them to ask their letter writers to do both, or to include the narrative part in the ESLOR? How are you advising your students at both your institutions?
We're advising our students to use just the ESLOR and then have our faculty use that narrative portion to add the meat to the letter.
George, you're on.
Yeah, sorry. Same for me. you can make the narrative portion as long as you want. There's no word limit there, and I think Tessa said it beautifully. The part we're interested in is not a regurgitation of the CV, but the real meat of what makes you unique and how you can reflect the relationship of the letter writer and the student in that narrative.
Yeah, and I would also just echo that at least what I've been doing already in the last couple of years is that I always submit the SLOR and just put a narrative along with it and submit it as one fell swoop to meet, because some programs want one thing versus another, and so that way it just kind of juxtaposes those quote unquote requirements across the spectrum. We have a couple more minutes on this section specifically. I want to ask Dr. Klein, Dr. Laporte, Dr. Templeton, do you have any other thoughts with regards to letters of recommendation specifically based on what you've heard from Dr. Dyer and Dr. Ballard so far?
I think I would just echo what they said about wanting to get letters from people who know you well, and that's going to be people mostly at your home institution this year, or people who have worked closely with you. The key is on the letter to make sure that it is telling us something about you that we couldn't otherwise figure out from your CV. And George or Dr. Dyer said a minute ago, it shouldn't regurgitate the same facts we already know. I think that's a really important point.
I agree with that, and especially would reinforce get the letter from someone with whom you have worked and someone who knows you well. Having the letter filled with sort of generic comments like they're nice or they're a team player doesn't tell us anything. It needs to not regurgitate your CV, but also give us additional information about who you are as a person and how you fit within orthopedics.
Thanks. And I'll just add one thing to that. I completely agree. It has to be somebody who knows you well. And like Dr. Ballard had mentioned, it can be, one of them can be from not orthopedics, but I would say no more than one. So I think all the other letters should be from orthopedic surgeons. Ideally, no more than one from people who didn't work with you clinically. That would be my feeling. So they should, I know that's maybe challenging this year, but if you have that opportunity, I think at least 2 of the letters should be from orthopedic surgeons.
I just want to ask one last question to Dr. Dyer and Dr. Ballard before we sort of make the pivot, which is, if you hadn't matched and you had a letter from someone last year who was in an academic system and is no longer in that academic position anymore, they've pivoted elsewhere, is that letter worth updating if they are no longer connected to the academic community? Do you think there's any benefit to using that letter again?
Absolutely. If that's a person who knew you well, they still know you well, and that's still a good letter. I think it's a perfect example of how the person's relationship is what's important, not their current job.
And I think especially if they can speak to, like I mentioned in the original question about sort of reapplicants and updating letters, if they can speak to your personal growth and development and your research growth and your clinical growth over the last year, regardless of where that person is working, they can still make reference to the relationship that they had with you and that rich academic relationship. And that's very worthwhile.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And so now I want to really pivot to something that I know has been asked of myself many times. And I wanted to kind of turn the microphone over to Dr. Klein and to Dr. Laporte with regards to how much value do you think there is in the quote unquote, as some of my students say, the dreaded personal statement. And I know it's something that we all had to do at some point in our lives, have to do it for various reasons. I just had to submit a personal statement the other day for something. But how much, at least as far as residency is concerned, residency applications are concerned right now, how much value do the 2 of you see with it in the application process?
I think there can be a lot of value to the personal statement if it gives some insight into a part of the applicant's character that you can't see in their CV. And I think that there can be little value to it if it doesn't really say something personal. So I think it's all in kind of the content and whether it shows something about you as a person that we wouldn't see otherwise.
Yeah, I think that personal statements are interesting. They definitely need to be well written, good grammar. You got to check your spelling. You don't want anything to stand out that makes it look like you weren't paying attention to details. But I read a lot of personal statements where I barely get past the first couple sentences. They just don't say much. And then a few catch my interest. So I think in the end, it can be really valuable if it's authentic and provides some insight into who you are, and written in a way that captures some interest. And that's not easy to do. Not all of us are great writers. And I don't think this should be like a creative writing assignment. Don't make it, a haiku or anything like that. Just, I think it's not going to hurt you if you just write a nice statement that may not be that impactful, but it could possibly help you if you have something that's just a little more interesting to read. So they're tough, but I think again, it's not going to hurt you if yours is a little mundane, as many of them are.
Dr. Klein, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that, like we've said many times throughout the first 6 webinars, or I guess the first 5 and now tonight, this year is a different year. And I think what Dr. Klein just mentioned is usually exactly how I feel about personal statements. I'm going to give a slightly different bent on the PS this year. And that is that I do think you have opportunities to personalize your personal statement for the programs that you have identified as those that were going to be the 3 places you were going to do your away sub-Is. And in the past, you didn't necessarily have to personalize it because you went to University of Chicago and you could hang out with Tessa and the faculty and the residents, and they found out you were interested in them because of that relationship. And you still may have talked about that in your personal statement to U of Chicago, but there was already a connection. And same goes with Harvard and WashU and University of Miami and Kansas and wherever else you guys were going to do your 3 away sub-Is. So I personally think if you have a genuine connection and you're able to talk about why you wanted to go to University of Chicago this year and why you couldn't, or we know why you couldn't, but that was a real reason. It was geographic, it was family, it was the way that they train their residents, whatever it is. You've had 15 students from your school go to WashU and they've told you about it and that's why you were interested. If you can make it genuine and personal, I think that this is the year that to me is an acceptable. If it's simply a copy and paste of University of Kansas versus Harvard versus Hopkins versus U of Chicago, then that's going to be a waste of everyone's time. And you can't do it for 10 programs, but I do think you can do it for the 3 that you had identified as the ones you were most interested in.
Yeah, I would echo similar sentiments in the sense of being able to be program specific with very genuine reasons why you want to, hey, go to a certain place or why you're intrigued by a certain place. One thing that you brought up, Dr. Klein, that I want to ask about is, what grabbed your attention? So I'll ask you this first and then to Dr. Laporte. So those personal statements that you've read that grabbed your attention and hooked you in, what was characteristic about those in those first few lines? What was sort of what grabbed your attention particularly about them?
I'll tell you, for me personally, what grabs my attention is some type of interesting personal story. So if somebody has an interesting background to share, a story that's a little bit different, they kind of give you a little piece of themselves in the personal statement. I find those interesting. And sometimes you may say, well, gosh, I don't know what, unique things I might write, and that's okay. But I think the ones that grab my attention are somebody who just has a unique personal story to tell and something authentic that helps me feel like I got to know them a little better.
Got it. Dr. Laporte, same question. What in the personal statement sort of stands out to you and grabs your attention a little bit more?
So I agree. Some examples that show your character, so don't just tell me that you're a hard worker, show an example of how you do that. I think you want to, if you have something good to say it at the beginning and you can say it again at the end, but don't hide it in the middle. So you want to catch the reader's attention in the first sentence or 2 if you can. And I agree, as an example, what's caught my attention in the past, there was a student from Columbia whose family had a competition. They would take the lawnmowers apart, and then the kids had to all put it together and see who could put their lawnmower together the fastest. Like, that was from like 5 years ago, and it stands out in my mind. So, if you have, some experience that, shed some light on you or your family or your character, or why you're going to be a great doctor or a great resident, I think that's something that would grab my attention.
One thing that I've seen in many statements that have been sent my way for review is, the notion of incorporating personal hardship, whether it be financially, whether it be familially, whatever the reason may, medically. How should students, if they want to sort of weave that in and what they've learned through this hardship, how should they or to what extent should they discuss that hardship without appearing, oh, hey, like, take pity on me? How in your mind, Dr. Laporte, do you think that they should include that or incorporate that in?
I think that's very personal, depending on what the hardship or experience is. But I think as long as you can tie it to some part of your character, so it shows either how you grew or how it makes you a more caring physician or a better resident, I think that makes it relevant to the personal statement, and it tells about who you are. I do think, relating a hardship, it has to be something that you're comfortable not just writing in the personal statement, but talking about, because if it's in your personal statement, it's in your application, and it's fair game for an interview question. So a little bit of thought about that before you put it in there. But if it's a part of who you are, and it sheds, shares some insight or tells something important about you, I think you can build that in nicely to the personal statement.
Dr. Klein, same question. How do you when you're reading these statements that have some description of hardship, what sort of stands out in sort of a positive way from an application perspective?
I think it always stands out as a positive when you can, present a hardship that happened in your life with a degree of insight about how that affected you and how you came out the other side of that hardship, maybe a little bit different than you were before. And then, as Dr. Laporte said, then how does that tie into you as a candidate for orthopedic surgery? I think that, sharing personal stories is a way to help people understand you better. So I certainly encourage people to do that if they think there's something very important that happened to them that then helped develop their character and made them who they are today and gave them some inspiration in terms of, pursuing the career that the career track that they're on now. And Dr. Laporte said another really important thing that I just want to echo. If there's something in the personal statement that you really want me to know about, that it's the most important thing that you're trying to tell me, and it's what you really want to communicate with that statement, it's got to be in the first couple sentences. Don't save it for the end like a big bang. Like, get it in there in the beginning to get us interested, and then we'll start reading.
Tabs, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I have
Sure.
read about 100 personal statements so far that students have sent me from around the country. And my only words of wisdom for you are the following. Please, not smaller than 11 font. Please, not longer than 1 page, if at all possible. Please, no typos. Please have somebody outside your family and loved ones read it. And most importantly, don't overthink the personal statement. If you have something genuine to tell, do so. We don't really want to hear about the 7,000th ACL injury as to why you're going into ortho. And so if that's really what did it, that's fine. As Sandy said earlier, that may be, you just want it to be neutral. You don't want it to be negative. But I think if you have something genuine to tell, and this is the year where the personal statement and the letters are going to be more heavily looked at, because we're looking for things that tell us about who you are, since we didn't get the opportunity to spend a month with you.
And I would add to that, as people keep saying, that the letters need to be genuine. So have someone read it who knows you, maybe not a close family member, but someone who knows you, because you want to describe what you've done and what you bring to the table, but you don't want to oversell yourself. When I read letters and students say that they're going into ortho and they will forever change the field, maybe you will, but it's kind of early to be able to know that. So you don't want to oversell yourself that much. What can get us to know you better, though, is, as was discussed by others, if you had a personal hardship, and how did you overcome that, or how did you stick with your determined career path? Because that shows us grit. I'm much more interested in seeing students with grit who can make it through hardships and persevere than someone who thinks that they are going to be the greatest orthopedic surgeon that we've ever seen. I mean, it's different. Grit is really what you need to succeed in orthopedic surgery and in life.
Dr. Templeton, that was really well said. I want to thank everyone for the responses so far. The question I want to just ask to the group before we pivot to our next section is, so if I didn't match, and so if I'm a reapplicant this year, and we're talking about grit and hardship and kind of telling the story, should I discuss why I didn't match in the personal statement, or am I then putting a giant bullseye on top of my head for that to be a potential greater topic conversation that needs to be during the course of the interview process?
I think it's a perfectly reasonable topic to address in the personal statement if you feel like you've got something to say about that that's going to be meaningful. I mean, we can tell from the application usually if you applied last year and didn't match. I think it sort of becomes obvious as you review dates and graduations and those kind of things. So it's nothing to hide or to be embarrassed about. It happens, and we all know that sometimes it happens to somebody that leaves us all scratching our head thinking, well, why in the world did that happen? So I think it's reasonable to address and to talk about it in an open way, and hopefully in a way that helps communicate how you stayed determined and committed and optimistic, even though that's a tough situation to go through.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's almost like talking about a hardship. And so what did you learn from that? Maybe why is your application stronger this cycle? What have you done in that extra time to make you a better candidate? Self-reflection. So some comment, not necessarily about why you didn't match, but why you're, how you've grown from that and why you're a better candidate perhaps this cycle.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think, and I agree with that. So thank you, Dr. Klein and Dr. Laporte. And thank you, Dr. Balich and Dr. Dyer for earlier. I didn't say that previously. I want to pivot now to what you all the students are now working on, which is actually filling out ERAS. And I'm going to put Dr. Templeton and Dr. Levine on the spot and start by asking a question that I know I've been asked about several times, which is, how important is the MSPE in your eyes? And do you think that the MSPE will be looked at more closely this cycle in particular relative to those prior to COVID?
I would say in the past, the letters of recommendation to me were much more useful than the MSPE because it allowed us to see how you function within your orthopedic rotations. It gave us much more useful information, I think, in terms of selecting residency applicants. However, as has been stated previously this evening, this year, the more information, the better. And so I know at least I personally am going to be looking at those letters much more closely because I need to glean whatever information I can about applicants whom I've never met. And so that's the MSPE will help. I still don't think it'll be as useful as your letters of recommendation, but it just gives us more information to try to build a bigger picture of who you are between your letters of recommendation and your personal statement and your CV. This is another piece of information that is probably going to be more important this year, although some of them are not terribly personal, so I'm not sure how much more, but I am going to be reading these in more detail to see if that helps add to the information I already have had, especially if applicants are coming from an area where I'm not sure why they would be interested in coming to Kansas. They don't seem to have any connections here. They haven't described that in their personal statement. Maybe there's something in the MSPE that'll help point me in that direction.
So Tabs, here's how I think the MSPE is helpful. There are 18 University of Miami medical students applying this year. It's giving Tabs his first 2 gray hairs that he's ever had. And so when I look at 18 MSPEs from the University of Miami, one way or the other, the dean and the folks, the advisory deans, have figured out a way to give clues as to how those 18 students rank compared to each other, not the other 850 applicants I'm going to be looking at this year. So there's no way around it. That is helpful for us. Because if last webinar, I put everybody on the spot and I said, how many of TAB's University of Miami students are you gonna interview? And the maximum anybody said was 3. And so that's just the reality. It's hard to interview a lot of students from one school. So MSP is very helpful there. The other way it's helpful is the narrative explanation of how you've done in your third-year core clerkships is something that you can find out some interesting information, both positive and unfortunately sometimes negative. So if somebody mailed in 5 of their 7 third-year clerkships and only focused on surgery and medicine, but didn't focus well on peds and psych and the others, then that's the kind of student you look at and you say, well, what happens if they don't like tumor and foot and ankle and hand, and they only like, sports medicine or whatever. So I think that's where the MSPE, to me, those are the 2 things that I look for, are helping to differentiate, and also how did you perform in all of your core clerkships, especially surgery and medicine, which I think a lot of people focus on, but also the rest that people might not be so interested in.
So that you've crossed off a few of my questions. Thank you, Dr. Levine.
Trying to help you out, Tabs.
I appreciate it. That brings up another sort of important point, which I'll call the white elephant in the room, which every student wants to know. Do you screen step 1? And so at least at University of Kansas, Dr. Templeton, if you screen step 1, do you have a cutoff that you can, kind of let the audience know? If you don't, you have other sort of metrics that you use to screen applications. And will you implement those screens this year in particular, just knowing the kind of, the craziness of it all?
That's a good question. As you know, that's a question that comes up every year is do we screen based on step 1? I have a pretty soft cutoff because I don't want to not interview someone who may just not be the greatest test taker. I also understand that everybody can have a bad day. And so you may have someone that has, is a member of AOA and they've gotten honors in their courses and they didn't do great on step 1. I'm much more interested in what your grades were or how you were evaluated during your medical school than I am in your step scores, because how you do in your clerkships gives us an idea of how you perform over time, not how you do on a single day. So I have a pretty soft cutoff. If anybody is within range of that cutoff, I'll look at their application because I want to make sure that I'm not missing something else. So if I do have anything else, yes, it's AOA membership. That's something else that I can use. And so if they don't make it into an interview request based on their step score, but they're an AOA member, then that will also get them in.
Okay, I'd like to take this moment to clarify the Twitter storm that I caused when I shared the information about the step 1 score and how many places to apply to. What we all have to understand is the step 1 score is one component of your entire dossier. If you did really well in your 3rd year, got lots of honors, if you have incredible scholarly productivity, if you have profound support from your institution and scored 240 or above on step 1, if you apply to more than 40 programs, you are over applying. I don't care if it's COVID year or any other year. So listen to that caveat and understand what we're saying, that in that context, the step 1 score is a predictor that overall you're going to get screened into every screening process, because if they screen at 240, you made it. If you screen at 250 and you got a 243, I guess you don't make it, but that's pretty rare. If your only thing you have is a 248 and you have 0 3rd-year honors, no AOA, no scholarly productivity, then of course you're a weaker applicant, relatively speaking, compared to that other peer group. So while we talk about step 1 as an easy screen, we have to all understand that we got to compare apples to apples when you talk about step one. If you have a low step one score, this is just brought up on the Google Doc today, your low step one score and a program screens, it does not matter what your step two score is. In other words, if you score 230 and Dawn says, I'm not looking at anybody under 240, then your 262 on step two does not get viewed by anybody with an MD degree. That's the harsh reality of it. If Dawn says, I'm going to look, we're going to set a screen at 240, but I'm personally, as a program director, going to look at anybody that's 220 to 240 because I think there are people in there that could be really outstanding residents, but they just didn't have a great test day when they took step one. Then that step two score will get reviewed by somebody with an MD degree, and you're back in the fighting chances again. So it's all relative to whether they do or don't have a hard cutoff. And I know the students would love to know which programs have hard cutoffs and which don't, and I just don't have that information. So all I can tell you is that you have to know kind of from your friends and mentors and advocates kind of which programs you think are probably going to still look at a 232 or a 234 and aren't going to just knock you out because of a one bad test day.
I want to just say also that it is just, as to echo what Dr. Levine has said and is being said in general, it's just one piece of the puzzle. I mean, I didn't have amazing test scores. It is a combination of everything. And that's what makes it hard to say, there's no formula. That's why some of the students who, have the best sort of academic records don't match. And some of the ones who you think wouldn't match end up doing that because it's more than just the scores alone. So just keep that in mind. One thing I want to ask you, Dr. Templeton, is some of these other things. So extracurricular activities. How important in your mind are these things? Volunteering, leadership, even research. How important is that in your mind? And when describing the volunteering clinical involvement, is there an optimal way to describe them?
I think it's critical to have that on the application because it gives us more information to see who you are as a well-rounded individual, not just how you do when you sit down to take a test or how you're going to do when you're in your clerkships, but what do you do with the rest of your time? But the caveat I would place on that is don't put down everything that you've ever done in terms of a volunteer position. I don't like to read applications where there are 40 or 50 different things that you've done. It's a one-day activity and then you move on to the next one-day activity. It's nothing bad about doing that, but that really doesn't help your application. At least what I'm looking for is a theme. Is there continuous level of involvement in a certain area in volunteer work that seems to make some sense so we can understand what your interests are and what you like to do outside of work. So yes, I would put down your volunteer activities, but only those in which you have had some continued involvement, because as Dr. Laporte said earlier, anything on your application is fair game for questions during the interview. So you want something on the application where if you're asked about that, you can actually talk about what your level of involvement was, and it sounds like it's something more significant than, again, just a one day where you participated in some sort of volunteer activity. In terms of research, yes, like as we keep saying this year, the more information, the better. Whatever you can do to try to round out your application, you don't have to do research to be able to match in orthopedics, but it certainly helps your application because if nothing else, it shows us a greater level of commitment to orthopedics, that you're willing to take time out of your otherwise busy schedule to also participate in research, ideally orthopedic research, but any kind of research gives us an idea that you're willing to spend extra time.
That's all wonderful. And Dr. Lee, I want to ask you one last question before we pivot to the last section here. You asked me earlier today with regards to submitted, if I have a bunch of submitted manuscripts, I have a bunch of submitted abstracts, where do you suggest that I actually include those on the ERAS application?
Well, I'm not an ERAS expert, but this is what I do know. I don't like to, under publications, That to me means something that has been published and that is something in press. And if you put other things in there, then it needs to be very clearly identified. So if I've submitted a manuscript and it's being considered, but it has not been accepted, it is not in press. It's not accepted. And so you just need to be clear and delineate that. And sometimes I understand ARIS might not let you be as clear as we would like. You just don't want to get yourself in hot water and put under publications 40 things that aren't published or in press, and then have somebody question your integrity. So just be careful and be very clear. If it does not give you an option in ARIS to say another category and it has to go under publications, then be very clear in parentheses, say submitted to Journal of Arthroplasty in review. That does not mean it's been accepted. It does not mean it's in press. So you just have to be clear about differentiating that. Does that make sense to everybody on this panel? Are you in agreement, or do you like to see something else?
No,
It's just
no,
one of my,
I agree. I agree.
okay.
And just remember too, again, it's
When in doubt, leave it
on
off.
your application, so it's fair game for a question. So if you're going to put something on your application about a research project in which you participated or a publication that's been sent in, make sure that you understand what the entire project was about, because you're going to be asked about it. Don't just understand if you just had a small part in the project, don't understand just that, but know where that fit in with the larger scheme of the project and what the question of the research was.
Hey, Tabs, can I
Yes.
ask this question because it's the second time it's been asked? My two
Sure.
big ARIS questions are about the experiences section. Would you recommend we describe them in paragraph form or in short bullets? And do you recommend filling out the why did you leave and hours per week sections? And if so, any guiding word for those? Tessa's nodding her head. So
Dr. Ballas, you want to take this one?
Yeah, happy.
I'm gonna send it over her way.
The nodding was a cue. So I love bullets. We are going to be reading long, right? Robust, rich personal statements, amazing letters, MSPEs, focused, sharp, precise description of your involvement in an activity is fantastic. The hours of experience and write what you did there is also super important. It reinforces what Dr. Templeton said about how meaningful was that experience? How involved were you? Is it something you did 1 hour a week for 6 weeks, or was it something you did 10 hours a week for 2 years? And then the why did you leave could be as simple as I had to start third year clerkships, right? And that's fine, but it lets us know kind of why you transitioned away from things. I think those are important.
Yeah, I would agree with the same. I say keep it simple to the point. Even potentially include what you've learned. You know, how is that going to be applicable to whatever field you're applying to, whether it's orthopedics or otherwise. I think that's also extremely helpful. One thing that I want to throw out to Dr. Dyer and the rest of the group is, you know, the big question, as Dr. Levine was alluding to, is the optimal number of programs to apply to. Do you have any strategies for how best to optimize this number? So I'm an average applicant, you know, whatever that average means. How should I go about deciding, you know, how many I should be applying to? And the caveat to that is, if I, according to the step one sort of metrics that are out there, as well as the CORD recommendations, if I'm applying to a lower number because my app is super strong, then do you think that faculty advocates are still critical, especially in this particular cycle? So two-part question to the group. Dr. Dyer?
Sure, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to just jump.
Yeah.
All right.
No, you're good.
All right.
No
So
problem.
I think the raw number is much less important than applying to the right places, and the right number of places it will be a little different depending on the strength of your application, but I don't think as different as people make it out to be. I don't know how many people really ever match to their 79th choice of residency. I don't think that happens very much. I think people either they match in their first 5 or maybe 10 or not at all. Really, that seems to be the dynamic of it. And so the trick is not to have 79 more places at the bottom of your list, but that the top 10 should be places that you're serious about and that will be serious about you, and that you communicate that in a way that they understand it and then that you connect. In a normal year, of course, the number one way to do that is by going to visit. That's not possible. So any other way you can connect with a specific place with your specific interest in training there, I think will make a difference. And I think the rest of the applications are really just kind of noise in the channel, and they actually hurt you. So diluting your message across 80 places, 70 of which you're not so interested in, is maybe a mistake.
Well, I'll just say one thing. When I talk to students and mentor them and they say, well, I have to apply to 80 programs because that's what the Google Doc said, or that's what a dean who hasn't spoken to anybody in the last 20 years told them, or whatever else the information is where they're getting that. I said, okay, let's do a thought exercise. Write down the 80 programs that you're going to apply to. And they have to struggle to get to 80 programs. So what Dr. Dyer's point is just spot on. If you're from the Northeast and you're interested in going to the Northeast, when it's a struggle to get to 40, let alone 50. And yeah, you can get to 80 by checking every box, and you can get to 187 and apply to all of the programs in the country by checking every box. But the reality is, and that's where that whole discussion we got into Twitter came up about how many programs to apply to, because your likelihood of matching does not precipitously go up by increasing the percentage of programs to which you apply. So that's really what our point was. And so it's your job as students, and I know that some of you are having a hard time with this because you write me about it and tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about, so I appreciate that. But you do have to get people from your schools to help tell you where you are ranked. If they flat out refuse, reach out to Tabs or reach out to me and reach out to others, and we'll try to help you. Because while I might not know exactly where you're ranked relative to your peer group, I can tell you how strong your application is. We've been doing this a long time, and a lot of us are happy to do that. But without a knowledge base or a foundation to know where you stand, it's very difficult for you to know how many programs to apply to. And that's why you guys all applied to 80 programs without proper mentorship or guidance. We're not blaming you for doing it. We're saying that we understand it, but try your best to get some inside information about how competitive you are.
So the question I want to ask to Dr. Klein is, do you think in this cycle, even if you have a super competitive app and you're applying to fewer programs, do you think the advocacy, having people reach out on your behalf, do you think that's super critical? Has that been critical at WashU in the past? Do you think it's even more critical in this particular cycle?
That's a great question. I think it's always good to have people reach out and advocate for you. I think it's hard to know whether that's actually going to change someone's process, though. And I would caution you to make it, a single person reaching out for you. I often get, something from 4 or 5 different people about someone. And I don't necessarily find that helpful. It almost starts to get to be too much. I think if you're couples matching this year, it's really important to do some of that to make sure that the programs know you're couples matching. At least where I am, I communicate with all the other program directors about couples that are orthopedics and something else. We try to figure out ahead of time, like where everybody, is in terms of our interest level. And so I think that's an important thing to bring to people's attention in advance, especially, the one that always gets us is if you're couples matching with somebody who's going into urology because they have a separate match. Like, you just have to let that be known way in advance, just so that the programs are aware, because that one has been an issue for us if we don't know ahead of time.
I think Sandy, couples match, it's the one advantage that couples match applicants have. You have every right to let your program know that you're couples matching, and then that allows us to call the other program directors and say, hey, is their partner competitive? And that will get people, you know, often noticed in interviews when they might not have, even if they're strong, because there was no tie. But now that they know Sandy wants the partner and the other partner is going into Gen Surge, that can really be helpful. But that communication has to be very early, not after the interviews are given out.
Could I just jump in? That's true even if both matches are the regular match. So Sandy's point is especially true if one is in an early match. But even in the regular match, we've had real like heartbreaking stories where somebody says right afterward, "Hey, my wife," like, dude, we really could have done something about this a month ago.
So that actually brings up that's a great point, Dr. Dyer. And, you know, and I would ask you, and I would ask Dr. Balich as well, when faculty members are reaching out to you to vouch or advocate for a student, for instance, if I'm reaching out on behalf of one of my kids, then is email preferable? Is a phone call preferable? Should we be reaching out to you as the PDs directly? And how many should we as faculty out and about be reaching out to? Is it 1, 2, 3? How many is sort of too many in y'all's mind?
So I'll start with the timing piece, because I think you asked that first, or at least it's on the tip of my tongue. I think this year, knowing that the applications are opening later than normal, we are trying to do reviews in a certain period of time and get interviews out and interview invitations out in a timely fashion. Like letting people know sooner than later is going to be critically important. And in the past, I've had people reach out to me after our interview invitations are sent out, and I'm stuck at that point, specifically those right in couples matches. So that was number one, and I just lost number two. Oh, how many people? So I think it's best to, in the same way that your letter writers, you want someone who knows you. If they know the program director well, fantastic. But if they know my partner better and can have a more personal conversation about you and make that sort of real connection, that probably means more than someone sort of cold reaching out to me, if that makes sense. Because then my partner is going to come to me. I got this amazing letter. I trust this guy. I know him well. He says this about, student number 55.
Right. That's a great student, I hear. Yeah. Dr. Dyer, same question. Do you prefer a phone call or an email? And should faculty reach out to you directly or to maybe a contact that they have at the Harvard Combined Program?
I wouldn't change a word of Tessa's answer. And I think that's just wherever the mentor or advocate has the best contact, the information will get to me.
Okay, wonderful. So Dr. Laporte and Dr. Templeton, I want to ask the two of you, when should students be letting programs know of their interest? Because should they be sending the messages now to y'all's inbox before everything is activated and they cannot really communicate much? Or should they be reaching out to program coordinators? What timing do you anticipate, and whom should they be reaching out to specifically?
I'll say I think now is a good time to reach out because then you can ask if there are virtual opportunities. They can join in to Journal Club. I can speak with them myself, which I like doing. So I would say, reach out to the program director. I think most of us are really excited to meet you now while we can and talk, and then connect you with some of our residents or other faculty based on your interests. I think the closer we get to when the applications are due, it's getting to be late in the cycle, and then once interviews are there, we really can't communicate after interviews. So I would encourage you to reach out to programs that you're interested in now, and you can always reach out to program coordinators, but I think you can reach out to the program directors directly.
I would agree. And before we are starting to review your applications, that way, if you do reach out to us, then we make sure that we are looking a little bit more closely at your application. But I would also say to limit how many programs that you communicate with, because yeah, I wouldn't reach out to all 187 programs to tell them that they're going to be at the top of your list. So select a few in which you are really interested, and then reach out. For me, I would agree with Dr. Laporte. It's reach out to me directly, typically via email. Let me know of your interest and why. Not just that you're interested, but what about our program or our geographic location or whatever it is that draws you to a given program, and why you would really like to join our residency program.
Hey, Tabs, can I ask a question from the chat box? I'm going to
Please.
ask this to my good friend from the great state of Missouri. Do I have to tell you, Dr. Klein, that I'm ranking WashU #1? Do I have to tell you I'm ranking you at the top of my list, which means not #1? What should I be saying when I'm expressing interest to you, Dr. Klein?
I always consider that email where they tell me that they're ranking me highly, or they're ranking me #1 is something that comes after the interviews. And I would say it's great. It should be honest. You should be sending that to a bunch of people. And I ignore all the ones that say that I'm at the top or I'm highly ranked. And I only pay attention to the ones that say they're ranking me #1. But I think it's helpful. I mean, it may not change a lot, but it just, I think it can kind of make a difference, you know, in sort of the subtle things, you know, that might happen at the top of the list. It's not going to bring you up from a lower number if our faculty and residents really, you know, didn't rank someone highly. It may not change that, but.
I've really tried to get our students away from this whole thing because the communication actually muddies the waters, and the match is designed to think that everybody's ranking everybody #1, and that works really well until you start messing with it. And I tell our Columbia students, I've really started to get away from the one phone call. I used to tell them it's kind of like prison. You get one phone call. And I've had a student tell me they wanted me to call George's program and tell them they was ranking him #1. And then they interviewed at 3 other places and they changed their mind. And I had to have them call George back and say, oh my God, they're now no longer ranking you #1. That's quite embarrassing. So you only get to say it once if you're going to say it. And
just one time.
I think for most of us, it doesn't change our ranking system whatsoever. We do our ranking and we're done, and those phone calls mean absolutely nothing. So, so for most programs, it's probably not going to influence where you end up being ranked.
Can I just one sort of brief amusing story? There was one applicant on to Sandy's point of being too honest, who sent me a weekly blow-by-blow for where my program was on their list. Harvard is in a strong second this week. Harvard is put down to #3. Harvard's back, and after about the guy was pretty high on our list until this began, and after about 3 weeks or 4 weeks of this, I'm like, you are so self-absorbed. I cannot imagine training you for 5 years, and I took him off.
Yeah, so this stuff can work against you sometimes too, right? I mean, again, I think one note to a program that was really great, if you really feel strongly about it, is fine. But if you don't send anybody an email, that's okay too. The match is supposed to work for you.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything said. And I would say just in general, be honest with yourself, be honest about what you want, be honest with your significant other, if your couple's matching, you know, if you decide to apply to, you know, all 200 programs, okay. But just know that there is rationale, as you've heard tonight, as to why we suggest not necessarily doing that. Really think about your application, talk with advisors around you, whether they be physically, you know, circa adjacent to you or even remote, as Dr. Levine was suggesting of, you know, he and I being willing to review your applications. But I think it's obviously a very anxiety-provoking process, and hopefully some of the information tonight has helped to assuage that a little bit. So, you know, we're almost near an hour here. I really want to just thank all the panelists. I am so honored and privileged to be able to do this with all of them. So thank you to everybody for joining us, you know, tonight. And then I just want to pass the microphone back to Dr. Lee one last time to close this out.
Well, thanks everybody. Listen, we do these webinars because we understand the angst that is out there for the students, and we have no other ulterior motives other than to try to give, you know, tonight 7 different perspectives. Often they agree, not always. And remember, we're giving the best advice we can based on the information that we've collected over the years that we've done this. It doesn't mean we have the right answer, and it doesn't mean that someone else is wrong. But we try to give you kind of our best gestalt based on the years of experience accumulated by a lot of really passionate and caring people here who spend time thinking about this. They spend time wondering, you know, what can we do to be a better educator, a better mentor, a better residency director, program director, associate program director, fellowship director, and so on and so forth. So it's really to me it's kind of heartwarming to see this group assembled to try to answer all these questions. We've done our best. That you guys have way more questions than I have time to answer in the Q&A and chat room, but we did our best tonight. You can always reach out to us, as we've said before, and many of you do. We did add the Ask the Attending section to the Google Doc. That has been run by medical students, and I think that's been a welcome addition to that document. And mostly to you guys, recognize that despite what you're fearful of in this COVID world, that a lot of the playing field hasn't changed as much as you might think it has. If you're a strong applicant pre-COVID, you're a strong applicant post-COVID and intra-COVID. And you have your 3 programs that you knew you were going to do your away sub-Is to. So those are the ones you should be focusing on in addition to your home program. And that's no different than what it was like prior to this horrible pandemic. And I think if you try to keep it simple, that will probably serve you very well. We wish you all luck. The next webinar will be November 16th. That will be important because we are going to cover 100% about the interviews and doing them virtually. And I think you'll find that to be very helpful in preparation for your interviews coming up. So thanks everybody for participating tonight, and have a great night. Thanks, Tabs, as always. Thanks to all of the faculty.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it. Have a great night.
Night.